Well, we're going to dial in now. So you just had a couple of presentations that did a lot of broad strokes around cover crops and different applications and systems. Sig gave a great presentation, kind of dialing into all the different aspects of cover crops and cover crop integration into the cropping systems and some of the pros and cons. And I was asked to dial in deeper and get more specific about weeds and nitrogen. And so this is going to be more of like a 301 or a 401 class. We're going to get very specific about nitrogen management and very specific about weed suppression with cover crops and really what's going on. So we're going to lift open that hood. We're going to get in there. Some of these figures are going to be very involved, but we're going to walk through them really slowly together and see what's going on. So my whole research program is cover crops. Everything I do is cover crops. We have anywhere from cover crop breeding to cover crop management to quantifying the benefits that cover crops provide to fitting them into long-term cropping systems experiments to also doing a lot of on-farm research. So all the kind of different aspects of cover crops, their management and quantifying what they do. Now I predominantly work with field crops like corn, soybeans, and wheat. But I certainly do interact with a lot of vegetable growers and have interacted with those systems. Got a homestead at home, so I have a little perspective about vegetable production. I'll try to link to that where possible. But really, I'm just going to stay principle-based. I'm going to talk about the principles of these cover crops and how they interact with the soil when it comes to nitrogen and weed suppression. So I think it's going to be very applicable. You're just going to have to think in terms of your system. So what are we trying to do with these cover crop-based systems? Well, first and foremost, we want to maximize profitability. If we're not maximizing profitability, then why are we doing it? So it's not going to fit into that system if it's not economical. But then obviously to improve use efficiencies of different inputs, minimize pests, and then these environmental benefits, conserve soil water resources, enhance these agro-ecosystem services. And as we get more variable weather, which a lot of you are already experiencing in your cropping systems, what can cover crops do to help with us for mitigating against these changing climates? And so cover crops play a role in all of these things. And what we try to do is quantify the benefits, reduce the negatives, and develop systems that work that are economical. I think Sig made a good point that when she put up that slide and talked about all her services and the benefits of cover crops and the different things going on with cover crops, it has a lot to do with biomass. Biomass quantity and biomass quality. You know, if you just got a small little cover crop that's just, you know, a couple of little, strands of grass that are coming out of the ground, yeah, maybe they might provide some erosion benefit. And I say some. But when you start to push the cover crops, increase the duration of its growth, optimize its management, that's when you start to experience more and more benefits. And that the bigger cover crops is where we get to see maximizing these different services that we're targeting with cover crops. So this is just a schematic of kind of many of the factors that affect cover crop performance. So planting methods, site-specific management, so that's kind of your systems and your regionality, the nutrient inputs, the genetics of the cover crop. All of these factors affect the way in which a cover crop performs. It's just like your cash crop. All of you, everyone in this room, grow plants for a living, right? So it's like every other plant you've interacted with. It responds to all the same things. How we manage it, how we care for it, affects the benefit we get. And those who are starting to think in terms of heightened management, like they do with their cash crops, with their cover crops, they get the most maximum benefits achieved. And it's all about the devil is in the details when it comes to cover crop management. Again, highlighting that point that there's these two factors that really drive what cover crops do. It's their quality and their quantity. So how much you have of it and what its composition is. And in simple terms, quality could be carbon to nitrogen ratios. What we're learning is, not all carbon and nitrogen is created equal. That's why we have things like forage analysis, because cellulose, hemicellulose, and lignin content, all of those things affect how cover crops perform depending on its composition. And then obviously the intrinsic factors like climate and soil, so that you can't control your climate and your soil for the most part. They'll interact with management and this performance quality here and quantity, and that is what predicts your results with cover crops. So we're going to cover some key types of life history traits here. We've got this legumes and we have grasses. Those are the main ones I'm going to target to make examples because I'm targeting weed suppression and nitrogen. So those two are the kind of the big players there. We're familiar with the legumes, right? They fix nitrogen. They have high nitrogen content. They rapidly decompose, and you're going to see that later on in this presentation, that folks think that legumes are a slow-release fertilizer compared to mineral fertilizers. And sure, they are a little bit, but they will decompose and release their nitrogen very rapidly and be at risk of leaching as well. And we'll look at that. The benefits here, obviously, is from compared to a mineral fertilizer, is they do have somewhat of a slower release. They do have this lower energy use. They're a renewable resource. And compared to animal waste products, you're not bringing a lot of that new phosphorus in. You don't have these volatility issues, so there's advantages with these cover crops. Transportation costs of hauling manure. Grasses are tremendous nitrogen scavengers. They can grow under a wide range of conditions. Legumes are more vulnerable to winter, where grasses have more ubiquitous, where they can grow. They're very hardy. They have aggressive root systems, as I said. They're good at suppressing weeds. But depending on the management, they could have a low or high carbon to nitrogen ratio. And that is really important. Folks greatly underestimate how much a small grass cover crop will behave like a legume versus a big grass cover crop will behave quite differently. And so when we kill that grass matters. And that's going to be a big part of this presentation today. So let's look at that in depth here. So this is just a table that highlights like low to medium to high range performances. So this is just like if you're at a low fertility site or a high fertility site or good soil conditions and good drainage, that's going to affect the range of performance. But basically at the tillering stage here, so this is just, you plant it in the fall, as soon as it comes up, it's in the tillering stage, and before it starts to elongate in the spring, cereal rye, for example, or barley or wheat, that it is in that tillering stage. And this is the kind of range of biomass you'll see. Anywhere from a couple of hundred all the way up to a really bumper cereal rye biomass. That's if you're a very high fertility site. And here's just as you move along in the growth stage. So stem elongation is just when it's elongating. The boot stage is when that inflorescence is starting to climb to the top of the plant. And anthesis is just when it's flowering. So pollen is coming out of the anthers of the cereal rye. And that applies to triticale and wheat and barley and all the others. And then legumes, this gives you a sense of the kind of range of performance you can get based on the timing in which you kill it, right? You pretty much are managing in a vegetative state. When it goes to flower, that's about the maximum biomass you're going to achieve. What I want you to cue into here is look at the CN ratios. Look at the difference between the CN ratios here and here. The growth stage of the cover crop, in this case hairy vetch or a legume or crimson clover, it doesn't change very much, that CN ratio, as it gets bigger. But the rye does, right? You get a lot bigger, and so all of a sudden you have this low CN ratio and it's becoming a lot higher, and that drives its behavior in the site. The higher the CN ratio, that means the more carbon it has per nitrogen. That matters. That really affects how it decomposes. It affects what it does into the soil. And so we're going to look at that in depth now. So just cue into that this is a big differences in growth stage, whereas the legumes don't. So this is an example of a study that highlights my point. So I'm going to just highlight some different experiments that show how in which we manage our cover crops and how climate and soils and these factors interact to affect what is the potential from a cover crop at any one site, right? Because the potential of a legume in Maine is different than the potential in Maryland. And so these are a collaboration between folks in Massachusetts, New York, Pennsylvania, Maryland, all the way down to North Carolina. And let's look at this. This is a complex figure, but we're going to walk through it together really slowly. So on this x-axis is seeding rate. So every single one of these panels, it's a 0 to 60, 0 to 60, 0 to 60. This is just the seeding rates in which we seeded hairy vetch. And this is the amount of biomass it produced. So the y-axis here is how much biomass it produced. And here's the different states, Massachusetts, New York, Pennsylvania, Maryland, North Carolina, on this north to south gradient. And here is our planting dates, our seeding dates in the fall. So this optimal and late. So the solid line, let's just look at Maryland right here. This is the optimal right here, and this is a late planting. One of the questions we had is a lot of growers are limited by time. And if you plant that cover crop late, can you compensate with a higher seeding rate and still achieve similar biomass levels? Well, the first thing you should cue into is look at this straight line right here. Do you see in North Carolina the straight line? See how it's a straight line in Maryland for the most part? What that is showing you is that it doesn't take a lot of seeds to reach the maximum biomass levels. We've been routinely recommending 25 to 30 pounds per acre of hairy vetch seeding rates. And in Maryland and North Carolina, if you get an optimal planting date, all you need is 5 to 10 pounds per acre. So right there, we've changed the economics of a legume in the system because legume seeds are very expensive. So they're costly to add into your system. So just knowing what these optimal rates are. So the point is the optimal is where it flattens out, right? This flat point says that basically it doesn't matter at this seeding rate or this seeding rate, this seeding rate. All these produce the same amount of biomass regardless of seeding rate. You can see here in Massachusetts or New York, it's still growing. So as you increase seeding rate, you are increasing biomass, which means that it doesn't plateau like it does in some of these other states. Does everybody see that? So some of the take-home message in this slide is that, first of all, if you're down in North Carolina or Maryland, you can produce a lot more biomass. Just look at the top of the biomass slides now. See, that's the top, the top, the top, the top. Or let's go use this. You see how it slowly goes down, that range there? So your ability to produce biomass is greater as you go south, so you're just more biomass. And there's a double whammy that as you go further south, you can seed at a lower rate. So you put less seeds out there and you get more biomass. Well, you do the math, that translates into dollars, right? You go up further north, you got to put out more seed and you get less biomass overall. And this dials right into nitrogen, right? So this is plant available nitrogen here. So if you're in this level of biomass here, like 1,500 or so, you're going to produce about 18 to 30 pounds of plant available nitrogen, not total nitrogen, plant available, what that crop and that growing season is going to see as this cover crop decomposes. If you get up into this range, into 2,500 to 3,000, you'll start to see 50 to 100. And if you get up in this 6,000 range around, you can get anywhere from 100 to 150 pounds of plant available nitrogen. So again, trying to just make the point that the cost of dollars per pound of nitrogen is much higher as you go north because you have to both increase your seeding rate and you get less biomass. So this is kind of dialing into that nitrogen story about legumes. We did see some compensation effects where you could, you still see like in these dashed lines where seeding rates did help increase. So even though you planted late, increasing your seeding rates did increase biomass, but it wasn't that impressive. It didn't seem that overwhelming. It doesn't seem like that the cost of all that additional seed is going to get you that big return on investment. So again, legumes, got to plant them early. Cereal rye. So let's focus on grasses now. This is indicative of most of the cereals we work with. We work a lot with cereal rye. It's a predominant cover crop across the U.S. Farmers, for example, in Maryland tend to use a lot of wheat just because we grow a lot of certified seed, and there's the cost share program. So there's a number of reasons why wheat tends to be a bigger cover crop in Maryland, but generally across the U.S., cereal rye is a dominant cereal cover crop. And so we're going to look at the difference between an early terminated and late terminated cereal rye. So you can see tillering at that tillering stage, just about to elongate, all the way up to the boot to anthesis stage here. And we're going to look at how that affects the soil, just when it's growing, before it's even killed. So this is a long-term experiment I have at Maryland. So let's just look at the bare ground and the early. So this is a profile of soil, and I'm sorry it's in centimeters, but I tried to help you out here with foot. So this is just 1 foot of depth here. So you can imagine this is 2 feet, 3 feet. So 3 feet into the soil profile. And this is the distribution of nitrogen across that soil profile. Mainly, you're just interested in this number right here, total nitrogen, right? Across this whole profile in a bare ground, so no cover crop in the fall, planted. Now you're at the spring and it's late March and you've got about 45 pounds of nitrogen in the soil. Compared to a small cover crop that was terminated at this time in March, you've got about 30 pounds of nitrogen. So rye is doing its job. It's scavenging nitrogen from the soil profile and preventing it from being lost into the groundwater or to be volatilized in the case of other pathways. Now, we look at a little bit later in the season. So this is early May. So before we were looking at how these two looked in early March. Now we're looking, late March. Now we're looking early May. We just killed the final cover crop. So this was no cover crop. This is killed early and it's small. And now it's just sitting around for several weeks until we come in to early May and kill this one. So it's all in the same field, but this is just showing the time interval. So obviously, if you kill it early, you don't scavenge as much nitrogen as you kill it late. The later you kill it, the bigger the rye grows, the more nitrogen it pulls out of that soil profile. This is something you already know. So I'm just kind of confirming this, right? You let rye grow longer, it uses nitrogen in the soil. So now I'm going to talk about how these plant materials release nutrients or decompose over time. And decomposition of the biomass is obviously directly related to how much nitrogen is being released into the soil as well. And I'm highlighting some work that we're doing just to give you a sense of what this looks like. This is an experiment that, for example, we're doing all up and down the mid-Atlantic into the south, where we're going on farms. This is predominantly grain farms, but we are interested in expanding into vegetable systems. But these are just farms all up and down the East Coast here, where the only treatment is cover crop, no cover crop. We don't control how they manage the cover crop. We don't tell them what programs to use for their herbicides. We don't tell them how. The only thing is that they're planting a cover crop and it's no-till that following season. But this is just to give you more a visual on how we collect biomass, right? So we collect biomass from the field, we put it into these mesh bags, and then we monitor these mesh bags over time, pulling them out of the field so we can see how the material is decomposing. So don't necessarily get too much decomposition from earthworms coming out of the ground and going into these mesh bags, but this is like mostly bacteria and fungi, so the rate of the decomposition of plant material. We're also doing all sorts of sensor work. We're looking at water dynamics, and farmers can actually go into this web-based app we made where they can monitor their water dynamics on their farm in real time, so they can just see the differences, cover crop and no cover crop. I'm not going to talk about any of that today, just talking about the cover crops and decomposition, but I just wanted to prime you for what you're about to see. So just more images of what this looks like. Taking biomass out of the field, monitoring it. Sometimes big biomass, sometimes small biomass. This is a no cover crop strips. Just gives you an idea of what we're doing here. Just an example in corn to get that solar panel above the corn, keep it up there when the corn gets tall so you can keep continuously logging data. So let's look at rye decomposition now. This is just 2 years. These are exactly the same, just 2 years. 1 year, year two. This is an early kill and a late kill. So the same nitrogen data I showed you, where we looked at how the differences in the profile behaved, right? So early kill cover crop, you kill it April 13th. Here we killed the late kill May 20th. Here it was March 29th, and here April 29th. This just tells you when we killed the cover crop. The corn was all planted a week after the second kill. So the corn here was planted towards the end of May, and here it was towards the beginning of May. Just different climates those years and some different growth differences. But you can see here the main point here is this is proportion of biomass remaining. So this means 50% of that biomass is left. So this is just showing decomposition, right? As you go down, you have less plant material on the surface. And you can see here, the bigger cover crop, the later killed, it decomposed slower and less. So you're left with more on the surface. See the difference between right here, this difference is how much is on that surface. We're not talking about roots, not talking about roots at all, just the shoots. So you can see that, yes, in 1 year that was wetter and warmer, we had faster decomposition. But generally, this small cover crop at that tillering stage, so when you kill it, when it's like this big, that's pretty luscious material. It's very green. It's got a lot of nitrogen there. It decomposes rapidly, similar to like what a legume will decompose. It's got a very low CN ratio. So you can see very rapid decomposition compared to this slow decay rate, which obviously affects how much carbon sticks around, how much nitrogen sticks around. This is, very self-explanatory and things that probably many of you are seeing in your own fields. And I'm sorry that I didn't put dates up here, but that's why I put them here. So April and May. So obviously this is the end of the season. So here's like September. So this is the growing season of corn. And this plays out regardless of biomass. So if you got a little bit of biomass, you got a lot of biomass. Basically, you decompose, and the more you start with, the more you end up with in the case of cereal rye. There is this little bit of an effect when you get really big that you get actually faster decomposition, because you can think about it, right? A mulch that's sitting on the surface that's thin, it's exposed to very violent conditions, right? The dew comes in, it gets wet, then it heats up and it's a hot summer day and it dries out. Microbes don't love this intense drying and wetting and heat and cold throughout the day. So on the surface, it's not very hospitable to decomposition. But as you get bigger and bigger cover crop mulches, then the surface of that mulch kind of actually insulates the bottom of the mulch. So the bottom of the mulch is kind of almost behaving more like a soil, whereas the top of the mulch is experiencing more of those extreme conditions. So you do get a little bit faster decay, but the point here is that more biomass means you get left more on the soil surface, and this is kind of what that looks like. Now let's add legumes back into this equation and look at how that's behaving. So this isn't a tillage-based application. So now we have pure hairy vetch, we have a 50-50 mixture, and we got this pure rye. Now these are big cover crops. All of these right here are kind of like bigger cover crops because we're targeting them also in this particular study for weed suppression. So they're bigger cover crops. So you can see that in the big cover crops, you don't get much change in decomposition very much as far as nitrogen released. Most of that nitrogen is going to like tied up. You get decay, but because there's so much carbon there, it just kind of sticks around and it's tied up. Whereas this 50-50 mixture, you can see it decomposes fairly rapidly, not as rapidly as a pure vetch. The pure vetch decomposes really rapidly compared to the mixture. Now what's interesting here is that the mixture of hairy vetch and cereal rye, when it's 50-50, it actually produces the same amount of nitrogen as a pure legume. So this legume right here has the same amount of total nitrogen as the mixture. However, the decay rate is totally different. Why is the decay rate totally different? Why is the decay rate? Carbon. So when you've got a grass legume together, the quality of that material is lower. It's got more carbon in it. And so you get the same amount of total nitrogen, but the amount of nitrogen that's actually released during that growing season for your crop to experience and take up is much less. Now let's look at this in a no-till application, just to show and highlight how soil management drives this. Now you get that same amount of nitrogen, but it's much slower release. So instead of like within 10 to 14 days, when you till that legume cover crop into the soil, it just explodes, releases its nitrogen into the soil. It's ready to be leached out of that system, and it's more vulnerable. Compared to in a no-till application, you get slower decomposition and better synchrony and uptake of those nutrients with the crop demand. So the main point here is just to highlight this slope that's slower versus this very steep slope, just saying that the rate of nitrogen release is much slower in no-till. Usually I bring up a phone to keep track of my time. How much time do I have?
You've got 20 minutes.
Oh, good. All right. You can listen to me blabber some more. All right. So this is the same work, but it's more broken out. And I don't want to sit a long time going over this, but it's just showing you pure rye to pure vetch. And these are all these different ratios in between, like a 75-25, a 50-50, these different ratios of vetch and rye. And all the only point here is just to show, like I showed, pure rye decomposes slower than pure vetch, and that these ratios are just everything in between the pure rye and the pure vetch. That here would be like a 50-50 rye vetch versus 100% rye or 100% vetch. And this is where we put poultry litter on the surface versus nothing. So this is how it breaks out. This is your pure rye, decomposes slow. This is your pure vetch, decomposes fast. These are these different ratios, like a 50-50 in between. And then when you add poultry litter, and you're putting more nitrogen in that system, you broadcast that, because this is like a no-till application, you can see we get much faster rates of decomposition. So when you do add nitrogen fertilizer on top of your cover crop, it affects its decay rate, which is not an issue if you're wanting to release nitrogen. It is an issue if you're trying to get a persistent residue to suppress weeds. Okay, now we're going to switch away from nitrogen, and we're going to talk about weeds. And I have this horrible slide that I made. I'm sorry, but it does allow me to say all the things I want to say. So I'm going to try to walk through this. Okay? The main thing to look at here is that this is your mulch. residue right here, this word residue, this is your mulch. This zone, this light gray zone is your mulch. And this is your soil surface. The first thing you should cue into is that the mulch essentially extends the height of the soil surface from a behavioral standpoint, right? If you've got nothing on the soil surface is experiencing that sunlight and that temperature, outside temperatures directly. If you put a mulch, you basically change the point in which light hits the ground. It hits it at a higher point, right? Because it's hitting the mulch first. And that affects all sorts of factors that affect weeds. And since I was asked to talk about nitrogen and weeds, we've switched to the weed part now. So these factors, environmental driver cues like light, temperature, precipitation, and oxygen, all of these things stimulate weeds to germinate. They're actually sensing their environment. Weed seeds are constantly sensing their environment. That's why they don't germinate in the middle of the winter. They germinate when it's optimal conditions. And there's a whole mess of stuff that goes into how dormancy is broken. But these are the factors that drive dormancy and that break dormancy. And if you put a mulch on the soil surface, you've changed the conditions at the soil surface in which those weed seeds are experiencing. So that affects things like its germination time, right? If the ground stays cooler, that means the weeds don't hit that temperature where it's like, okay, it's warm now, let's go. It didn't get there yet because there's a mulch there keeping it cooler. So that delays the germination of the weeds. When we think about cover crops from a weed suppression standpoint, they are just part of the program. They are not going to provide you persistent season-long weed control for the most part. In some applications, some big covers can, or it depends on your system, but generally weeds are complementary. So when we think in terms of weed management with cover crops, we think of ways to benefit the crop and delay the performance of the weeds. We don't expect that we're going to eliminate the weeds, but we may delay their germination, we may slow their growth rates, we may make them more vulnerable to the cash crop, because we know one of the most effective weed management tools we have is an aggressive, competitive growing cash crop. If our cash crop is growing really well and it's competitive, it's going to do a lot of what we're looking for. So these environmental cues, like I said, are blocked by this residue. And so these germination cues will affect this dormant seed bank and this active seed bank, and the rate in which they're going to germinate. So you get these effects on the germination. Then obviously the moisture conditions affects retention of the mulch affects moisture at the soil surface. We find actually a lot of times on small cover crops where you kill it like early, like those little tillered out cereal rye, that'll actually stimulate weeds to grow, because it creates a microenvironment that holds the moisture in. So in the spring, if you get a lot of drying and the surface ground is not very moist, many of those weed seeds will just kind of sit there. But if you've got a mulch creating that microclimate, it can hold the moisture there longer and create a better environment. And we routinely see this relationship where no cover crops will impact weeds. Small little cover crops can actually sometimes stimulate the weeds, and then as you increase the biomass, you decrease the weed performance, and we'll look at that in a second. So moisture from the mulch matters. Then there's this physical interference. So the physical effect of a cover crop, we actually call all of these physical effects. These germination cues we also call physical effects because we call light and temperature a physical effect. The mulch affects the light and the temperature, but it also is just an impedance, right? When the weed is trying to grow up and it hits that physical barrier, it's just a physical impedance that blocks it. So this is another factor that's affecting the weeds from going from a germinated seed now to an emerged seed. And then there's these other items here, like the carbon to nitrogen ratio, which affects nitrogen availability, and the allelopathic compounds. Does everybody heard the word allelopathy before? It came up in an earlier presentation. Folks are familiar with it? Just get a sense, okay? I'm going to define it in a second anyway, but allelopathy can affect a germinated seed from emerging, and nitrogen immobilization can do the same, right? If a weed seed it germinates, and as it's emerging, if there's not a lot of nitrogen around there, it can struggle. This is particularly important if you've got a legume cash crop like soybeans or green beans, right? If it fixes its own nitrogen, it doesn't need nitrogen as much from the soil, then creating a low nitrogen environment can actually give you a benefit and an advantage against the weed. So these are the kinds of things that go into suppression of weeds with a mulch. And I kind of went out of order here because I should have, I don't know why my other slide's not here. Where is my other slide? It's gone. All right, well, too bad. I had a slide that walks through all the different fates oh, I skipped it accidentally. I must have jumped over it. So that's why I was wondering why I was talking about that. Cover crop interactions, weeds. This was the introductory slide, sorry. Anyway, so living cover crops are your best mode of action on weed, right? When a cover crop is growing, it's very aggressive. It can outcompete weeds very easily. This is the number one way that you're going to compete with weeds, which means that if you want to affect weeds with cover crops, you generally, if the best mechanism is when it's growing, that means it's going to affect the weeds that are problematic for the cash crop that would be planted at that same time. So a winter annual rye cover crop would be very good at suppressing weeds in a winter annual wheat crop. You know, that's when it's most aggressive, is the weeds that when it's growing and it's alive. Then when you terminate it, that provides an opportunity to kill weeds. Herbicides, mowing, roller crimpers, tillage, all of these impact weeds in the system at the time in which you kill the cover crop. So if you've got an early kill cover crop, you know, you probably don't have a lot of weeds emerge. But if you're doing a later kill cover crop, you probably got a bunch of weed seeds that germinated or maybe even emerged. And when you kill the cover crop, you're impacting the weed seed bank and the weeds in that system. And then terminated cover crops are mulches. Either, you know, when you till them in, you don't get the physical benefits, right? Like light, temperature, and these physical barriers that I was going into in that next slide. But you do get some of the chemical and nutritive, right? Chemical is allelopathy. Nutritive is like nitrogen immobilization. And nitrogen immobilization just means that there's not a lot of nitrogen, there's a lot of carbon, nitrogen is limited, so the microbes are just taking whatever available nitrogen is out there. So nitrogen immobilization is just simply the microbes have sucked up all your nitrogen and it's not available to your plant. And that is real, and it's happening all the time. Nitrogen is constantly going back and forth from being immobilized and bound up in microbial biomass to being released and available. It's happening all the time throughout the year. And we manage our systems to try to manage that dynamic to optimize availability of N. Anyway, so this sets up the point about the physical effects from the mulch. These chemical are both. And then I went into this whole mulch explanation. So let's look at a mulch now. This is cereal rye mulch. And I put this threshold here because it just varies on the system. Some people have high thresholds, lows. This is more of an organic threshold in grain crops where you really start to impact performance. I mean, but we routinely see 15 to 100 to 2,000 pounds per acre of weed biomass in these organic systems. And I imagine, you know, unless you've got extensive hand weeding operations, which I know you do in your vegetable operations, you won't see that kind of biomass. But this is where you really start to see impact. So now this is what the weeds look like without a cover crop. So just as you increase your cereal rye mulch, you see that little bump I was telling you about? That bump is that at low cereal rye biomass, you get a little stimulation of weeds because that's holding that moisture in. But then as the biomass increases and you get more thicker and thicker mulch, that's when you get much more suppression on the weeds. This is in the absence of a crop. This is just the effects of the mulch over the growing season. And we add, we add a moderate to high seeding rates of soybeans, and you can see just the interaction between the cover crop and the cash crop. Planting the cash crop itself obviously reduces the weeds because it's competitive against the weeds, and increasing the seeding rates gave us an advantage over the weeds, which means that we were able to get below some of these thresholds sooner at lower biomass levels. But the point here is that it takes a lot of biomass to get a lot of weed suppression from the physical standpoint. Allelopathy, we talked about earlier, is just this form of, it's a plant interference where one plant excretes chemicals into the environment, into the soil, and that chemical that it excretes affects other plants. So it's a way of saying, hey, this is my area, get out of here. I own this area. I'm going to produce a bunch of chemicals you're not going to like, and you're going to have to metabolize them, and so that's going to stress you out, so get out of here. And that's what allelopathy is, right? And here's just some examples of effects, where at the seedling stage where some of these were experiencing phytotoxicity to red clover solutions. But the point I want, and don't look at any of these. These are just a bunch of different chemical compounds, and don't look at these numbers here. The only thing I want you to look at is this is the roots, and this is the shoots. The vast majority of the allelochemicals that are in the soil that are coming from cover crops are predominantly coming from the roots. The shoots are not playing a major role in allelopathy for the most part, by and large. And look at the speed in which it's gone. So this is time. What is this? This is 7 days, 14 days. So like within 2 weeks, most of these compounds are at very low levels and are not affecting the system very much at all, compared to the shoots, which are low from the beginning and stay low, right? There's just not a lot of allelochemicals. So if you're killing a cereal rye cover crop at the tillering stage, right? So when it's small, it's like no allelochemical concern, right? Because if you're killing something in March or early April and then you're planting in it the beginning to middle of May, those compounds are just not a concern. So if you're seeing some impact from cover crops, it's likely a nitrogen effect, it's likely a pathogen effect. There's other issues. Allelopathic chemicals are short-lived. They do have an impact. It's not dramatic. They're not going to be the solution to weed control. They're going to provide another one of those little hammers, those little benefits, right, that will impact the weed, but just not a lot.
If I cut cereal rye as a hay, take it off, are the roots going to add any humus to the soil, build up the soil?
So the question is if I take off my shoots, how much benefit do I get from the roots from a soil organic matter standpoint? And that's why we're doing this work, because we're really excited about that question, because growers are using their above ground biomass for forage or other purposes. And so how much comes from, 5 minutes left? Okay. How much comes from the roots alone? And basically, the roots are a big player in the carbon storage in the system. We haven't fully quantified that over time, how much of a role it is versus the shoots. But there's no question the quality of the roots are more persistent. I mean, they're meant to live in the ground, right? They're supposed to hang out there and function without decomposing while the plant is living. So they're constructed to be more resistant to decay than the shoots are. And so absolutely you will get a lot of benefit. The degree to that we haven't fully parsed out.
If you kill off your rye later in the maturity cycle, if it's out there, will it take long for the allelopathic to dissipate?
2 weeks. So this is a big cereal rye cover crop. Within 2 weeks, many of them are really low by 7 days. But by 14 days, most of these compounds from the roots alone are not a major player, allelochemical standpoint.
That's what some guys say that even corn would have that effect as far as the seed.
That's right. That's right. So I'm going to skip all this stuff. I'm going to skip this. I'm going to skip this. One cool little point to highlight when you're working with mixtures. So what you're looking at here is that same earlier I was talking about hairy vetch and rye in combination. So this blue is just 100% rye, and this red is 100% vetch. So 100% vetch, 100% vetch, 100% vetch, 100% vetch. This is 100% rye. So you're going from pure rye to pure vetch, and all this is just different growth stages of corn. So this is just time. This x-axis is just time. Early in the season, late in the season. And what pops? Vetch stimulates weeds. It's leaking nitrogen. It's decomposing before you even kill it. It's pouring that nitrogen in the soil, stimulating weeds to germinate. And those weeds are problematic well before you're even getting well along into the season. And just low levels of a grass. That's what I thought was so cool. The low levels of a grass in itself had a big effect. Just getting that vetch off the ground, slowing its decomposition, and mixing it with a little bit of rye had a big effect on the weeds from a mulch standpoint. All right. I want to just highlight something that's brewing in this region, and then I'm done. So what folks might not know about is the development of the Northeast Cover Crop Councils. Who heard of the Northeast Cover Crop Council? All right, we got 1. 2. You went to the first meeting? Awesome. So we just formed the Northeast Cover Crop Council. I'm really excited about this organization. We've been spending many years to get it off the ground. Last year was this past November was our first meeting. And you can see right here our next meeting. I'm going to tell you about the next meeting. The second annual conference is November 15th and 16th, and guess where it is? It's at your friendly Penn State University this year. So last year was at Cornell. This year's at Penn State. We kind of rotated around to give different growers an opportunity because we know that you're not going to travel really far just to hear about cover crops. But for those local, which is obviously applicable to this room, We're going to have this meeting annually, and this meeting, the organization is committed to support the successful implementation of cover crops for economic purposes, environmental and social benefits, and providing science-based solutions. We're defining knowledge gaps by coordinating together. We're fostering research and collaboration with farmers, providing best management practices, and something that you should really cue into is that we're also developing web-based decision support app tools, and these are going to be coming on pretty soon. We have specific tools that are coming in the form of nitrogen calculators like this, being able to give you an output of what your nitrogen release pattern is from a cover crop to help you plan. So you would just enter some simple information. You would send a little plant sample to this lab, get a little report back. These are all part of this kind of decision tool framework that we're trying to develop that would then be interactive. So you could go online and based on some of your objectives that you list, you'll get input about a species recommendation, seeding rate recommendations, nitrogen release patterns, how that's going to interact with your water dynamics. We're going to be kind of covering economics aspect of it. So please stay tuned in to this. Please come to the Northeast Cover Crop Council's next meeting. It's going to be an annual event rotating around the region, and it's a lot of great folks covering both grains and veggies. So we'd love to have you there and engaging. Thanks.